Saqqara, Egypt, 332 BCE. Torches flicker through a temple carved into the desert rock. The scent of resin, smoke, and rot thickens the air. 7,000 priests move in silence, their linen robes whispering like ghosts. Before them lie 20,000 animals: cats, ibises, crocodiles, even sacred bulls, each awaiting a god's touch or a butcher's hand. The high priest raises a bronze blade to the moonlight and chants the opening of the ritual of breath. The crowd kneels, drums echo once, twice, then stop. That night, Egypt performed its largest act of worship and its darkest act of desecration. A single ceremony meant to honor the gods of life became the greatest mass mummification and quietest massacre in human history. For the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't an ending, it was maintenance. Life continued beyond the tomb, and everything you loved was meant to follow you there. Kings were buried with gold and ships, but commoners found eternity in smaller ways, through animals: cats, ibises, falcons, jackals, living symbols of the gods themselves. To mummify an animal was to send a message to heaven, to offer a soul as tribute. By the late period of Egypt, this devotion had become industry. Entire cities worked around death. Saqqara, Abydos, Tuna el Gebel, not towns, but necropolises. Markets sold offerings by the cage, kittens mewling in reed baskets, hawks tethered by silk cords, monkeys sedated with incense. Pilgrims came from across the Nile with copper coins to buy favor from the gods. For the right price, a priest would promise your cat to Bastet, your falcon to Horus, your dog to Anubis. The body would be blessed, dried, wrapped, and sealed in linen stamped with divine sigils. But by the reign of Nectanebo II, demand had outgrown faith. The temples were drowning in offerings, tens of thousands every year. Mummification had become mechanical. Priests began sacrificing animals in bulk, embalming not for piety, but profit. And when the moon of Koyak rose, they gathered for one night each year, a single mass ritual where thousands of priests labored side by side under torchlight, preserving 20,000 souls to please gods who had long since stopped listening. It was called the Ceremony of the Breathless Ones. And in the desert outside Saqqara, its fires would burn for 3 days and nights, until even the gods averted their eyes. The desert trembled with preparation. For weeks, caravans arrived from across the Nile Delta, bringing cages that rattled and whimpered under the sun. Donkeys dragged carts loaded with linen, natron salt, and oils so precious that thieves followed at a distance, waiting for the careless. From Memphis came the high priests of Bastet, jackal-masked embalmers of Anubis, falconers sworn to Horus, 7,000 in total, each claiming divine purpose, each guarding a secret formula of death. At the edge of Saqqara, the temple of Anubis stood carved into the limestone cliffs, its mouth dark as an open grave. Inside, the great pit waited. The walls were painted with stars, their eyes flaking from the centuries of smoke. Here the ceremony would begin. Here, 20,000 living offerings would be transformed into silence. When the first bell rang at sunset, the desert shifted color, gold turning to red, red to black. The priests moved as one body, carrying torches in a line that looked, from a distance, like a burning serpent crawling across the sands. The sound of chanting rose, thousands of voices blending into one slow, rolling drone that seemed to shake the air itself. Behind the temple gates, the animals were lined in rows, cats wrapped in papyrus baskets, birds trembling in reed cages, jackals with muzzles of gold thread. The priests whispered prayers not for mercy, but for perfection. The gods demanded purity in death. Imperfection would anger them. The chief embalmer raised his bronze dagger to the moonlight. His assistants brought forth a bowl of resin, black and thick as blood. The ritual had begun. Above them, the desert stars blinked coldly, watching a civilization turn devotion into industry and mercy into math. When the final torch was lowered into the pit, the chanting stopped. For a heartbeat there was silence, then the first cry. A cat's scream cut through the heat, sharp and brief, followed by the low rumble of drums. One by one, the cages opened. The ceremony of the breathless ones had begun. The priests moved in rows, their linen robes already soaked with resin and sweat. Each held a task. One slit the throat, another caught the blood, a third packed the body with natron. It was rhythm, not ritual. A production line for the afterlife. The air filled with smoke and sweetness, myrrh, cedar oil, and death. At the center, the high priest of Bastet held a jeweled dagger shaped like a crescent moon. Before him, hundreds of cats were arranged on reed mats. He whispered a prayer that once carried mercy. "Return to your mistress and guard her realm." But the words had grown hollow. He raised his hand. The knives flashed. The sand ran dark. Elsewhere, ibises were drowned in basins of wine and salt. Falcons were strangled with silken cords. Snakes were pinned with bronze nails in wooden frames. Each species to its god, each death to its market. The embalmers worked until their arms trembled. Every body was packed with natron, dried with the desert wind, and wrapped in linen. The linen came from temple donations, offerings once meant for the poor, now used to swaddle corpses of animals who had never lived long enough to see the sun twice. By midnight, the pit glowed with torchlight and heat. The smoke rolled upward, thick and heavy, curling into the shape of gods who no longer answered. The priests chanted louder, their voices cracking with exhaustion and guilt. One apprentice dropped his bowl and stumbled back, crying that he heard the animals still breathing beneath the wrappings. The overseer struck him silent. "Do not speak," he hissed. "They are gods now." And gods do not scream. By dawn, Saqqara looked like a battlefield, the sand blackened with oil, the air rippling with heat. Inside the great pit, smoke rose in veils, and the ground itself seemed to hum from the weight of so many souls. The priests did not rest. They moved through the haze like spirits, their eyes red from sleeplessness, their voices hoarse from unending prayer. What had begun as worship now felt like punishment. The embalming chambers beneath the temple were a labyrinth, narrow tunnels lined with shelves carved into the rock, each holding the small linen form of a god. The smell was overwhelming, resin, decay, and the iron tang of blood. Apprentices carried baskets full of newly wrapped mummies, their faces gray from the fumes of pitch and smoke. The overseers shouted above the noise, "Hurry! The gods wait for no man." In one chamber, a scribe knelt beside the embalmer's altar, documenting every sacrifice in ink and ash. His tablet listed the numbers: cats, 9,834, ibises, 6,102, serpents, 2,710, others uncounted. He hesitated before adding the final line, "All made pure for eternity." He knew it was a lie. The priests no longer believed purity was possible. They were simply feeding an obligation too ancient to refuse. At the heart of the temple stood the colossal statue of Anubis, jackal-headed, silent, and flecked with smoke. The high priests assembled before it, lifting their bloodied hands toward its face. "We have obeyed," they said. "We have given you all." But even as they spoke, the torches began to sputter. The air thickened with a new smell. Not incense, not resin, but something sour, unnatural. Moments later, the first priest fell, choking, his skin blistering beneath the linen. Then another. The apprentices screamed and dropped their offerings. The temple fires flared blue, burning hotter than oil. The fumes of the mummification, the resin, the natron, the pitch, had mixed into a poison cloud. The gods had answered after all, not with blessings, but with breath. When the sand settled, the temple was silent again. The torches burned low. Thousands of mummified creatures stared from the walls, their eyes sealed forever, and the priests who had sealed them lay among them, wrapped by the same smoke they had summoned. Days later, when the surviving priests crept back into the temple, they found it changed. The air was still thick with the ghost of resin, but it no longer smelled of holiness. It smelled of rot, of something that refused to stay dead. The lower chambers were scorched black, the shelves sagging under the weight of 20,000 wrapped forms. Cats with gold-painted masks, falcons bound in linen wings, crocodiles coiled like serpents in bundles of pitch and silk. They worked in silence, sealing every corridor with limestone slabs. Each chamber was closed with prayers etched backward, words meant not to honor, but to contain. The high priest ordered the entrance filled with sand and plaster. "No one must enter," he said, "not for 1,000 years." Then he pressed his palm into wet clay and sealed it with the mark of Anubis. But Egypt's gods have never kept quiet graves. Over centuries, sand buried the temple, storms stripped the desert, and dynasties fell. When grave robbers found the site in the late 1800s, they thought they had discovered a treasury. What they found instead were mountains of animal mummies, stacked to the ceiling, paws, feathers, fangs, all wrapped in resin and linen turned to stone. Archaeologists later counted the remains by weight, 20 tons of sacred death. When they unwrapped the first cat, its body crumbled into dust. The linen still smelled faintly of oil and thyme. The next one had no bones inside, just straw, sand, and fragments of other mummies. It wasn't faith, it was mass production. The priests had been selling emptiness to the gods. In the center of the pit, they found something else, a human skeleton bound in the same way as the animals, its skull painted with soot and gold. Around its neck hung a charm carved with a single word in ancient demotic script: repentance. The curse had kept its promise. The ceremony of the breathless ones had taken not just the lives of the offerings, but the souls of the men who gave them. When word of the discovery spread, Cairo's museums overflowed with relics from the pit. Boxes of mummified cats, birds, even beetles stacked like merchandise. The smell of ancient resin clung to the crates as they were opened in the heat. Local diggers refused to stay after dark. They said they heard scratching from inside the sacks. At first, the scholars laughed, until one fell ill, then another. Within weeks, half the excavation team was bedridden with fevers no doctor could name. Reports were buried in museum archives, rashes that spread like burns, nightmares of suffocation, whispers in empty corridors. When a night watchman vanished near the storerooms, the rest refused to enter. The project was quietly shut down. The crates were sealed and labeled unstable organic matter. They remain in vaults to this day. But what unsettled archaeologists most wasn't the illness, it was the writing. Etched along the inner walls of the temple, beneath the soot and salt, they found a second inscription. It wasn't a prayer or a dedication, it was a warning. Let no man disturb the breathless ones. Their rest is not peace, but balance. Break it, and they will remember the world that forgot them. Under ultraviolet light, the words glowed faintly, written in a mixture of ochre and blood. The curse wasn't superstition. It was history written by guilt, the last confession of the priests who had turned worship into slaughter. Even now, Saqqara's sand shifts with every storm, uncovering bits of linen, claws, and beads. Locals say the wind there carries the sound of breathing, faint, shallow, endless, as if 20,000 small lungs never learned how to stop. The desert keeps its silence, but it never forgets. And sometimes, when the moon is full over the ruins, the wind smells faintly of myrrh. That's when the guides leave early, because every story buried at Saqqara ends the same way, with something once sacred, still waiting to be forgiven. In 2019, a new team of archaeologists returned to Saqqara, armed with drones, scanners, and the arrogance of the living. They found the burial pit again, deeper than the maps predicted. Cameras rolled as they brushed away the first grains of sand, revealing painted eyes staring back. Thousands of them. Each animal mummy had been wrapped with a single symbol drawn over the heart. Not hieroglyphs, but something closer to a tally. Count marks. The same mark appeared on the walls over and over. At first, they assumed it was a counting, a record of offerings. But one scholar realized the marks formed a pattern that spiraled inward. When overlaid digitally, the pattern matched the constellation of Orion, the ancient house of Osiris, god of the dead. It wasn't bookkeeping. It was a map, a celestial trap, binding the ritual to the stars. The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. The lowest chambers were untouched since the day the priests sealed them. Jars of oil still full, linen still smelling of cedar. And on the floor, scattered among the animal mummies, were human teeth. Dozens, filed flat. No records mention their burial. When the chief excavator entered the final vault, his microphone caught a faint whisper, like wind through a reed pipe, though there was no wind underground. He described it as breathing, steady and low, coming from the sealed alcove at the chamber's far end. The team broke through the plaster, revealing a single human mummy, unlike the rest. Wrapped in black linen, eyes painted open, lips sealed with gold wire. The inscriptions around it were not prayers, but verdicts. He opened the mouths of the gods. He silenced the living. They realized they had found the high priest himself, the architect of the mass ritual, buried among his victims. His final act was to mummify himself alive. The footage ends abruptly. The official record claims equipment failure, but local workers say the camera lights flickered and one of the team collapsed, gasping, as if choking on invisible sand. The expedition withdrew the next morning. The chamber was resealed, its coordinates classified. And so, once again, the desert took back its secret. A ceremony that was never meant to end, and a silence that was never meant to be broken. Today, the sands of Saqqara lie quiet again, but the wind still moves strangely around that pit. Visitors say it hums, as if the desert itself remembers. The archaeologists never returned. The footage that survived was archived under a false label at Cairo University, unverified ritual documentation. Only a few frames are visible, the gleam of torches, a mask half buried in sand, and something that looks like a cat's paw pressed against glass from the inside. The modern world calls it myth. The priests called it duty. Maybe it was both. 20,000 offerings turned to dust, 7,000 priests turned to memory, and one ceremony that turned faith into a weapon. What they believed would preserve life became a monument to death, a temple that mummified not just bodies, but conscience. Every empire builds its own silence. Egypt's was perfect. The gods stopped speaking, the dead stopped rising, and the living stopped asking what it cost. Somewhere beneath those dunes, the black linen priest still waits, surrounded by the hollow eyes of everything he offered, the breathless ones, the gods that never wanted to wake. Because in Egypt, death was never the end. It was a system, and like all systems built by men, it eventually ran out of mercy. If you still want to walk the sands where the gods were sold, where prayers turned to profit, and where silence has a sound, subscribe. History doesn't whisper here. It breathes.